The younger generations have been brought up for kind of instant gratification, and we see that in the investment world where the 0 day options, Robinhood, people are trying to quickly make something happen. We just posted a chart the other day that shows the average holding period is now less than 1 year. Right, you're listening to Avery's Around the Desk podcast, where we dig into markets, companies, and ideas shaping what is coming next. I'm Sean Emory, your host, founder, and chief investment officer here at Avery & Company, an investment firm investing where the world is headed. Today I'm so happy to bring on Loujaina. She's the senior economist at Revelio Labs. Tongue twister, but one of the most data-driven voices out there in the labor market. She is part of a team that analyzes millions of job records, hiring trends, internal workforce dynamics, and really just trying to understand what's happening, in the workforce. So we're bringing her on. If you're trying to understand where the future of work is headed, listen to this one. Before I get into it, though, this conversation is for informational purposes only. It should not be considered investment advice, even though we're probably not going to talk about any specific companies. But we may hold positions in some of those companies discussed. If we do, please do your own research before making any investment decision. Loujaina, you're calling in from New York, right?
Yes, I am in New York, and I am happy to be here.
Yeah, same here. Really excited to have you on. We've been trying to do this for a while, going back and forth through emails. So again, happy to have you here. Right now, I think, everyone's focused on the jobs market. We've got the Fed meeting this week. It's Monday as we record this pre-Fed meeting. There's a lot of interest in understanding the true health of the labor market. At the same time, AI is creating, new dynamics that people are trying to make sense of. It's not just about whether jobs are being lost. It's really about how they're changing. We're big advocates of your work. I get in the email quite often. I've always appreciated the depth and thoughtfulness behind a lot of your work. So I think this is a perfect time to have you on here, and hopefully in the future as well. But let's start there. How would you describe the current state of the jobs market as we head into the back half of 2025? And, maybe as we go through this conversation, what are some of those dynamics we should be paying attention to really beneath the surface?
Yeah, so at Revelio Labs, we have a lot of data. All of it is public that we collect and standardize in order to be able to think about the labor market in general. So we have data on hiring that we get from different sources like LinkedIn and so on. We have data on job postings so we can observe market demand. So that's the type of data that we basically analyze for most of our research. So in terms of big headlines about what is going on in the labor market, so the main things that we're observing is we have very slow hiring rate, but we also have very slow attrition rate. So companies in general aren't hiring as they were hiring before, like a year or two before. But at the same time, workers aren't also leaving the jobs, right? So yeah, there are layoffs that we have been hearing about in the news, we're seeing in the data, but in general, attrition is very low. Like people aren't changing jobs that often. On the demand side, we are observing a weaker demand. So demand has been going down across the board. Some industries are doing better than others, of course, but in general, we're observing this decrease in labor demand in the US workforce in the past, like maybe year and a half or something.
Yeah, and that kind of matches up, I guess, with what we're seeing. You're talking job openings, I believe. So really over the past couple of years, we've seen job openings steadily come down. Hiring is still happening. It's not something where, we're concerned about, a blow up in the labor market. Some are, but unemployment remains low and many metrics, the job market looks relatively stable. But that drop in job openings has kind of led to some, wondering if we're heading towards something bigger in terms of a slowdown. Having you on today makes a lot of sense, given the exact moment we're talking about. So give us your read. What trends are you seeing right now across that hiring landscape? Strengths, weaknesses. What are you seeing, today?
So in the past few months, we have been actually seeing like very large declines pretty much across the board in terms of job demand, in terms of like job postings in general. So yeah, like most industries have actually been seeing like large declines in job openings, but it's seasonal, right? So it's summer. Um, Things are generally slower in the summer, but yeah, but we're generally observing them to be slower than they were last summer or the summer before. So yeah, so I guess we're keeping a close eye for like the fall, when when things hopefully start to shift again. There is also a lot of uncertainty going on with like the general macroeconomic direction, like tariffs and so many other things going on. So it's really actually hard to sort of like predict what's going on. But like we're basically keeping a close eye to see how things are gonna look like in the fall.
That makes sense. If we go back to, April, May, we saw some turbulence in demand trends and just different signals that we track at least. Then in June, there was some stabilization. And I think through July, we've seen that even more so here. And, if you listen to restaurant companies, food and beverage, consumer oriented businesses, there seemed to be some sort of pause related to kind of commerce overall and some of that momentum waning. But, now in July, it feels like things have started to pick back up again. Again, we're talking 30, 45 days. So looking at the data for you from the past, 3, 4 months, call it compared to the last 30 to 45 days, kind of that rate of change. Are you seeing any signs of stabilization that match some of the other data we're tracking? Or does that, kind of softness remain persistent in certain areas?
Yeah, well, we are. I mean, it's still on the downtrend, but it is getting more like there was like a big downtrend earlier in the year, but this is getting more stabilized in the last month or so. But yeah, but in general, it's generally more down due to like the increased uncertainty that we have been observing throughout the economy.
Right. And look, the job market is still pretty full by historical standards. We spoke about that a little bit earlier. If you're using unemployment as your gauge, 4% is about as close to full unemployment as it gets. But you and the team, you recently put out a really interesting piece on what you called stickiness, specifically that new employees aren't sticking around the way they used to, older employees sticking around a little bit more, at least not leaving. And why do you think that's happening? Is it onboarding expectations? Is it some sort of generational disconnect? Is there a mismatch between what workers want, what companies are offering out the gate? We just love your general perspective on why retention seems to be dropping among those new hires, while these kind of older, more tenured employees seem to be staying put. Anything in the data that you guys have jump out?
Yeah, so in general, one trend that we have also been observing along with the decline in attrition is the decline in employee sentiment. Like it's a little bit strange here because it's like people are upset with their jobs, but they are also not leaving the jobs at the rate
Right.
that we would expect, right? So there is also a lot of things going on in terms of employee sentiment. And employee sentiment data, it's actually very good data, right? Because it's anonymous, and for for very big companies, like people are more likely to actually like say the truth, right? So typically when we look at this data, we look at really big companies where people are more likely to be less identifiable, so we can get really good signals from them. So what we have been observing for a while is that decline in employee sentiment across the board, across all seniority levels, across all positions. It just people are not very happy with their jobs. um, so for a lot of reasons, right? Like if we also look, like we have the overall ratings, like like the overall score that people give for their companies, but also we have the breakdown of these ratings. And one of the things that we observe a lot is people rating their companies much lower in culture, the overall environment in the workplace. And the other thing that we're also observing, especially for early career, like entry level employees, is career opportunities, right? So people aren't really seeing that they are making a lot of progress at work. Plus, the culture is affected by everything that is going on around them, from like the increasing call for return to office to like layoffs, to like not a lot of opportunities to be promoted and so on. So all these things are contributing to people being like not very happy at work. But also like it's the one of the most competitive labor markets if people are trying to find another job, right? So older, what we're seeing in the data is that like older, more experienced folks stick around longer, but younger folks are trying to like move into other places where they can see like better opportunities, especially for maybe career growth or something, right? Like if someone is starting out their career, they wanna make sure that they are on track, to be to advance in their career, right? So that's probably one of the reasons why we are seeing this trend of the higher attrition, quote unquote higher, right? Because attrition is generally low, but we're seeing higher attrition among people who haven't been in the job for so long, right? They
Right.
tend to change companies faster.
That makes some sense. If you think of the structure of, let's say, a company, it's, almost a triangle, a pyramid. The top is typically, occupied by older, tenured employees who aren't really moving much and not moving, uh, even more so today, according to your data. And at the same time, newer or younger employees at the bottom are feeling stuck, like there's little mobility upward. Now, layering what's happening at the micro level from a technology perspective, especially AI, you have this younger generation that's not necessarily thinking about climbing the ladder the traditional way. They're really thinking about, can I spin up a product quickly, start a company, partner with others, and build something on my own? That's the mindset shift, and I think it's real. It brings us to kind of an AI conversation, and one of the recent pieces that really stood out to me from you guys, you made the case that AI isn't taking jobs. That's our feeling as well. It's changing them. So I'd love to hear your perspective on that. Which roles are you seeing change the most? Which ones are most kind of enabled by AI? Let's say HR, software development, sales and marketing. How is AI actually showing up in the data? Not just theory and all of us, hypothesizing, but what's happening in practice. I'll step back, give you the space to really unpack it, but just curious to hear what you're seeing.
Yeah, definitely. So AI is definitely one of the things that is, playing a role on how we're viewing the aggregate picture in the labor market for sure. So everyone knows this by now, but AI is just very, very different from previous waves of automation, right? It's generally affecting white collar workers, right? It's because it really excels at tasks that require sort of pattern recognition, analysis. And so on, as opposed to like manual work, right? So we're finding like more white collar workers being affected by this. We also have the data to sort of measure adoption, or get a proxy for adoption, or how much people are using AI in the workplace. So the two main pieces that we analyze in this report that you're referring to, Sean, are the exposure, like how much of the tasks in a given job can be augmented or even eliminated and replaced by AI. So that's the exposure part. And we have the adoption part, which is how much people are using AI in the workplace, or reports using AI in their workplace. So when we combine these two pieces together, we basically get an idea of how AI is actually really affecting the workplace. So yeah, so what we find is that over time, we find that the demand for AI exposed roles is declining. So roles where there is a large share of the tasks that can be performed or augmented by AI, the demand for these roles is declining. Okay, so this is, this can be, if you look at this at face value, is like, oh, you know what, AI is taking people's jobs, that's not good. But actually, this is not the case. We are arguing in that piece that this is not the case. And the reason we're doing this is because, there are two pieces for why demand for AI exposed roles is declining. One piece of it is that, there is generally in the economy, there is a replacement of jobs, right? So in general, there is more need for like manual work, or for jobs that are less likely to be replaced by AI. So that's one part of it. The other part of it is, like the tasks inside the jobs themselves, right? So the within job aspect, right? So it's that people, or employers are basically changing how the jobs are looking like, because there are things that can be eliminated now. So that's basically what we try to break down. So what we find is there is the demand for low AI exposure jobs is higher. And basically, when we look over time for what is happening, we find that there is basically a change in the, like the biggest reason is that the change in the makeup of the economy. So there is more demand for low exposure jobs, right? So there is more demand for jobs that most of it can be performed manually without necessarily the need for AI. But also when we look at the other part, like within the high exposed job, we actually find that there is the demand within high exposed job. There is much higher demand for roles that adopt AI at a higher pace. So jobs like data science, jobs like data engineering, jobs that are very highly exposed to AI are being demanded at a much higher rate compared to jobs that have low AI adoption, right? And that's why we make this conclusion that it is not that AI is replacing jobs in any way. If anything, we find that the demand for high adoption roles is actually increasing at a much faster rate, right? So employers do need these high adoption roles, but in general there is also a shift in the makeup of the economy. Another thing that we're observing is that, if we actually look at job postings and analyze job postings in more details, we look at the tasks that are included in a given posting, we're finding that there is a decline. There is basically a change in the, like for a given role, there is a change in what are the tasks that will be performed in the job, right? So if we look at this, like, 2-3 years ago, the type of tasks that we observe is very different from the type of tasks that we observe now for the same role. Okay, so for example, tasks like data document, like data documentations, clerk type works, all these tasks are basically being dropped completely. Things like operation supervision, stuff like this, all these tasks are being dropped from job postings and are being replaced by other tasks that are more demanded now. So this has a lot of implications for basically, if someone is going out on the market, how can they prepare for such a labor market, and like what kind of skills that they need to know in order to be able to perform the expected tasks.
Right. So a lot there. I'm looking at one of your recent reports, and something really caught my eye. I'm going through it right now. Jobs with high exposure to AI seem to dip early on and then flatten out through 2023. But now we're seeing something interesting. I'm looking at so jobs that are AI enabled, meaning, if I'm reading this correctly, meaning roles that are actively incorporating AI or can be, in some ways replaced through AI, are actually increasing, while those with low AI exposure are actually declining. So what's happening there from your point of view? Is this the case where, ChatGPT and other tools, when they launched, there was a period of kind of like testing, exploration. Now we're seeing that adoption translate into kind of real hiring and role creation, and or just enabling your teams to then use these AI tools and improve productivity. It almost looks like, again, workers and companies are leaning actually into these AI threatened roles, while those outside that curve are tapering off. Is that right way to read this? Yeah. So what's your thoughts there?
Yes, yeah, and this is basically coming from high adopting, like roles that adopt faster, right? So if we think about high exposure jobs, we can think about two very broad category. We can think about something like data related jobs, like data science, data engineering, software development, stuff like this. And on the other side, for a high exposure job, there are jobs like customer service related jobs, right? So yeah, what we're seeing, like this increase in demand for the high exposed jobs, this very tiny little increase in demand for high exposed jobs, is coming from the high adopting, the roles that have managed to adopt AI at a higher rate, like data science, data engineering, and so on, right? Because basically what is happening is these workers are using AI to increase their productivity. They are becoming very productive, right? They can do so much more now. With the resources they have, right? So that is basically leading companies to demand more and more of these workers, as opposed to like roles that are low on AI adoption, that are these workers are basically at risk of being eliminated. Like, so if we're going to talk about like the risk of AI, the risk of AI is basically not thinking about how you can incorporate AI in your jobs and in your own job and actually increase your productivity from it.
Yeah, interesting. That really aligns with our view here at Avery. There's this broad narrative that AI will replace jobs. We see it completely differently. Our belief is that AI will enhance jobs, and people who learn to use AI will simply become more productive. And when productivity goes up, simply, companies will hire more people that are more productive instead of less productive people. ultimately that's what it comes down to in terms of the ROI equation for leadership of a company is, dollar of output equals, some sort of dollar of input. So if you think about it, if there's a sales rep, they're using AI to generate leads, communicate faster, close more deals. You're going to hire more of them, not fewer of them, because each one is now producing more output per hour. Same goes for things like software developers, which has also had a narrative that is, software development will, become somewhat obsolete. And that may be true to some extent, but there was this fear that developers would become, completely obsolete. But that's, not necessarily happening. And it's happening, quite the opposite, specifically when I look at your data. And companies can now prototype, let's say just 10x faster. So the smart ones are asking, why not push it to 100x? So you hire more people. And that creates, this new velocity layer inside of organizations that I don't think existed before. And then there's kind of this culture side that I'm looking at in your data. And one of your reports, I noticed really this positive correlation between employee sentiment and AI adoption. And that tracks with what we're seeing too or hearing too when companies start using AI to offload many of those repetitive tasks. And again, before this was RPA, robotic process automation, but people are shifting to become, let's say, more creative, a little bit more strategic, a little bit more project manage oriented type roles. That leads to morale improvements because the work gets more interesting instead of redundant, and the tools become enablers, not necessarily threats. So, kind of, does that resonate with what you're, continue to see in that database?
Yeah, so this is something that I we want to work on a little bit more because it's actually a robust result. Like we have seen this, like this was like the first time we run this analysis. We did this simple correlation thing. But even when we control for stuff, we're still seeing that positive correlation between AI adoption and sentiment, right? So I guess big part of it might have to do might we're still working on this, but in the way I would think about it is has to do with like it if you're a worker and you an AI is helping you finish the job at a more at a faster rate, at a more efficient rate, you're getting higher recognition from your boss or whatever, then this will generally improve your view of the workplace, right? This can also potentially affect your career opportunities, right? Because if you're performing better, you're more likely to get promoted, and so on. It can also affect things like work life balance, right? You're more efficient. You used to have to stay until like 8 p.m labeling data. You don't have to do this anymore, right? Because ChatGPT or whatever can help you. So this can also sort of like improve your perception of the tasks that you have to do. So there are a lot of things to unpack here. It's a very interesting area, that relationship between sentiment and AI adoption. So yeah, that's basically how we think about it. Like generally improvement in like the career opportunities potentially, or like like your trajectory at work, and potentially also work life balance.
Right. And like sidebar, how are you guys, I guess, using AI at your company?
Yeah, no, we do use AI a lot, right? So a lot of like our modeling team definitely does use AI a lot for like building uh, models that are based on AI. At the economics team, we definitely use AI a lot for a lot of things. Like data analysis, like simple data analysis that used to take you forever to like to write code to generate one plot, right? So you can just like move faster and do more things and do more interesting things. So it's basically like cutting out the redundant, unnecessary well, I wouldn't say unnecessary, they are very necessary, but like the redundant boring tasks, at least for if you're working with like big data sets, just analyzing them and trying to get patterns of them, it's very helpful.
Yeah, and something you mentioned earlier offline really stood out with me. You said you guys are actively hiring right now, which I find fascinating. Your whole business is understanding the labor market. You're tracking the shifts in AI adoption, workforce sentiment, hiring trends, and you're deciding to grow your team, which I think speaks volumes. It tells me you're seeing opportunity, not necessarily contraction, let's say. or not that concerned either about, let's say, the jobs market, which would impact the economy. So with that in mind, let's shift gears a second. You publish a ton of research and reports lately, and instead of picking myself, I do want to open it up to you. Is there any sort of recent pieces, research pieces that you've worked on, your team's worked on, that you think people should be paying attention to?
Yeah, so one interesting thing that we looked at, I personally looked at in the past few weeks, was basically the federal workforce, right? So, yeah, I guess we all know what has been going on with the federal government since the new administration came into office. Federal workers have had a lot. They were mandated to go back to in-person work 5 days a week. They were put on deferred resignation, so on and so forth. So yeah, so what happened is also like very recently there was a Supreme Court decision that basically permitted the administration to proceed with with the with the with the workforce cuts, that decision was overruling like a lower court decision to basically stop with the cuts, right? So now the administration can actually continue reducing the federal government workforce if they want to. So yeah, so we basically looked at what happened to federal workers in the past 6 months, right? Like, did people leave? Did people stay? What happened, right? So we did observe outflows. Some of it is due to layoffs. Others are people voluntarily moving, right? So we observed like a lot of headcount, like large headcount losses in places like the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, the Federal Transit Administration, the USDA. So we observe very large declines in headcount in these organizations. We also wanted to know what kind of workers are actually quitting the quitting or being laid off, like who has left the federal government in the past 6 months. So the key thing that stood out is the profile of people who are leaving the government are younger workers, like younger in age, who haven't who have a much shorter tenure in the government. So we're basically hired more recently than people who ended up staying, and the outflows are overrepresented in areas like public policy, legal support, and legal counseling, right? So this is basically something that caught our attention, because if young people are leaving the government at a much faster rate than older people, then this basically puts us at a problem of, okay, so like 10 years down the road, right? Who is going to be left in the government, right? If young people are leaving now, then this is basically putting the, like, we're missing a generation that should be trained in order to lead the government in the next in the next decade or so, right? So this is something that, like, actually policymakers have to really think about, right? uh, like the type of outflows, or how they can attract the type of talent that we want to stay around in order to like retain the next generation of federal workers. That's something that we think that is important to start thinking about.
And what's interesting though is we're seeing the same dynamic play out, I guess, in the private sector too, right? It's not just government or public sector issue. It's younger, less established employees are also the ones turning over more frequently in the private sector. So again, this is, it raises the question. Let's say, is this less about public versus private and more about generational shift and how younger workers approach careers? That's kind of my gut feel here, but ideally, especially in the government, we definitely want to see a strong pipeline of young talent coming in, learning how institutions work, eventually take on leadership roles, and kind of that's a healthy cycle. I think we should all strive for. But if that same early exit pattern is happening across the board, public or private, then maybe the real story is something deeper about expectations, purpose, or even how younger workers I guess define career. So what do you think about that?
So it is definitely a generational thing, right? Like, in general, we have, like, if you look at like an intergenerational comparison of job tenure, definitely millennials, Gen Z tend to like their average tenure per job is it's much lower than previous generations. So there is a generational aspect here. But and we are like you're right, like we're seeing this in the private sector as well, like right, people who have been in the companies for a shorter time are leaving more. But the thing about the federal government is a little bit different though, because the federal government has always been perceived as one of those like amazing career paths, right? You
Like a
enter the
safe job,
federal
yeah.
government, you stay there for I don't know, like 5 years or something, and then you start being eligible for all these benefits. You stay longer, you're
Hmm.
eligible for pension, so on. So it has always been a very attractive career path, and this is a trend that we haven't really noticed before, right? So yeah, so worker retention, I guess that's the interesting part of it, is like, the nature of federal work that has always been attractive for a lot of people. And we're seeing like the younger people basically responding to taking away all this, benefits from the private sector by just from the public sector jobs and basically starting to act like it's private sector, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, which is something to think about, right? So yeah, so generational aspect for sure, but also the nature of federal work is something to think about when we analyze this.
Yeah, and I think a big part of this ties back to how the younger generation has been shaped by instant gratification. We've seen it clearly in our world, the investment world, from the rise of 0-day options to platforms like Robinhood, where the idea is to make a quick buck. Holding periods that used to be measured in years are now measured in weeks or even days. We just put out a piece on that. That same mindset spills into other areas, social media with TikToks and Reels and delivering content in 10, 15 seconds, entertainment where everything is fast, reactive, built for kind of this immediate payoff. And naturally, that expectation, that human nature starts to bleed into what looks like the jobs market too. People want to be successful right away, which is a good thing. They want to lead, they want to build, they want to move up in 1 year, they want to move up in 2 years. The idea of a 10-year grind doesn't really resonate the way it used to from kind of a corporate ladder perspective. So we're seeing this feedback loop where how we entertain ourselves in our daily lives is influencing how potentially we think about our careers, our goals, and even what we define, I guess, success. And that creates, real challenges. It creates opportunities. It creates a lot of, speed and adoption of things. But I guess for company structure, career paths, mentorship, it's definitely different.
Well, there is also, I guess, the like what you're saying, like there is so much exposure to different things that will, I guess, make people want to try other things
Yeah.
as well, right? So if you think about the labor market, like in the past, this is what you studied, this is what you know how to do, you got this amazing job, why leave, kind of thing. But now, yeah, this is what you studied, maybe you don't like it that much, and you're seeing other people doing other things, so yeah, maybe I can try doing these other things as well, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Also, I guess, back to the AI. So, like AI is definitely helping, like in terms of adoption in general. We're obviously seeing younger workers adopting AI at a much faster rate, right? They know how to use these things. They know how to use it for work, but also for their own personal choices, right? Helping them in general being more productive and more mobile as well.
All right. So, yeah, let's bring it all together here. We'll stay on the government theme for a moment and then we'll just wrap it up. As we await, the Fed's decision, here this week. Obviously, the expectations are for nothing really to happen. And then August there's no Fed meeting, and then we get to September, and if everything's good, that's a good thing. If we're concerned about the jobs market and inflation, that's where people should get concerned. But let's just go back, from the start of the year and even now, there's been a lot of concern about around the jobs market, especially when it comes to government employment. One of the insights from your data that stood out to me was the shift happening within the public sector from federal jobs to state and local ones. We were watching this closely earlier in the year when headlines around kind of Doge and broader kind of federal workforce cuts were potentially in place. And one thing we talked about internally was and externally was the idea that state and local governments will act as a bridge, trying to absorb some of those workforce transitions to ensure that there wasn't a big impact on their local economies. So I'd love to close here, but what are you seeing in that, public sector data right now, particularly around, the shift from federal to state and local, and, anything else you're seeing?
Definitely. So yeah, so we're seeing these workers that left the U.S. federal government in the past 6 months. Many of them ended up between like two sectors: the academic sectors, like they're going back to school or they are taking some kind of an academic job, or the other main destination for these people who left the federal government was actually state and local governments, right? So state and local governments actually offer a lot of opportunities as well. You have still like a civil servant, right? You are probably going to maybe still being eligible to very similar benefits to the federal government. And also people are going to potentially, like a lot of people join the federal government because they care about the work, they care about policy, right? They want to make a change. So state and local governments is also an opportunity for them if their decision to join the federal government was motivated by their desire to serve. So they have an opportunity in state and local governments as well. So that was a very large destination that we saw in the previous 6 months, which is slightly different from what we saw before. So I guess
Yeah.
in January we had another piece looking at federal workers who left the government in the past 5 years, like just in general, people leaving. And state and local governments didn't actually come up as one of the main destinations. Um, Academia did come up, but state and local governments didn't come up that much, or
Huh.
it wasn't that big. So I guess that's something also that is like changing. Like a lot of people who are leaving the government still wanna remain civil servants. So that's a great destination for them.
Perfect. Look, let's wrap there. Really good conversation so far. We'll probably have you back, really to break down what else is happening in the jobs market, following your data. If other people want to follow your data, follow your work, where can they find you?
Yeah, so we are online, www.reveliolabs.com. If people are interested in the data, they can schedule an appointment and meet with a representative that walks them through the data. We have a very interesting dashboard that you can visualize all our data very easily. Doesn't require people to know a whole lot of coding to visualize the data or query the data or see it through our dashboard. Our sales and business development team are very happy to walk anyone who's interested through our platform. We also have our weekly newsletters. The economics team, my team, produces them. You can also find us on our website, and you can subscribe so you get them in your mailbox. We do a lot of interesting work, right? So every week, if you're subscribed, you get a newsletter about a particular topic. We like to crowdsource ideas from the audience. So a lot of times, we send out a newsletter, someone asks a very interesting question in response, and here we go. We have another very interesting problem to think about. So yeah, so that's another thing that we really value, like the feedback and the additional questions that we can ask. We're also on all social media platforms, LinkedIn. We have the economics team does the video abstracts every week for the newsletters that we put out. We appreciate engagement on these, what other data sources are showing, how this ties to other areas of the economy where people are seeing similar trends and so on. So that's basically how you can find us and how you can engage with us. And we look forward
Perfect.
to all this engagement.
Perfect. We're ending there. Appreciate you coming on. I knew it was going to be a good one. I'm glad we could make this happen. Hopefully, we can do it again. Again, appreciate you coming on Around the Desk. We'll do it again in the future, and you have a good one.
Thank you so much, Sean. It was a pleasure meeting you, and it was a great talk.